Je vous remercie d'être venus pour ces 2 journées qui portent le nom de Reclaim Justice, que nous avons co-organisé avec mon collègue Nat Marran. Je suis trop près de la chouette. Bon, je me déplace. Oui, nous allons parler à la fois en anglais et en français, c'est pour vous prévenir. Un certain nombre d'interventions seront directement en anglais, d'autres directement en français, ce qui va vous demander une certaine vélocité mentale, mais je suis sûre que ça ne va poser strictement aucun problème. Donc, la raison en est en particulier parce que les coûts d'une traduction simultanée sont très importants et que par ailleurs, nous tenions vraiment à à travailler ces questions à l'international. Donc voilà, c'est un mélange de ces 2 raisons qui explique ce choix. Je voudrais tout d'abord remercier Isabelle Anguelovski d'avoir fait le voyage depuis Barcelone en train. Je tiens à le souligner, d'être venue en train pour vous parler de ses travaux. Et elle va ouvrir ces 2 jours de workshop en venant vous parler de la Great Gentrification. Elle va parler en anglais, je crois. Elle parle parfaitement français par ailleurs. Et donc, vos questions peuvent être aussi bien en français qu'en anglais en fonction de ce que vous souhaitez. Nous introduirons par la suite les 2 jours de workshop avec Nathan. Et nous parlerons à la fois en français et en anglais, donc en espérant que ce mélange soit aussi harmonieux que possible. Donc voilà, les repas sont prévus ici, il y a un traiteur qui est même dû à vélo avec ses repas. Donc voilà, nous avons essayé de faire aussi bien et je suis désolée pour les difficultés pour rejoindre cette salle parce qu'elles sont indépendantes de ma volonté, comme on dit à la télé. En revanche, pour ceux qui vont parler, il y a une chouette qui vous regarde et qui vous entend. Donc, cet objet-là est étrange avec les 2 yeux. Et donc, pour ceux qui parlent, elle se tourne et il y a de nombreuses personnes en ligne il y a 156 inscrits sur ces 2 jours, la moitié en ligne, la moitié ici. Donc, je pense que ça va tourner. Voilà, je voulais vous remercier encore une fois et saluer Isabelle pour qu'elle nous rejoigne. Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Est-ce que tu veux que je coupe un peu la présentation ou qu'est-ce que vous avez du coup?
Non, on rattrapera après, t'inquiète. Fais ta présentation comme tu l'as pensé.
Il faut me faire un signe quand il faut changer de slide. Je peux plutôt m'asseoir, non. Ou la passer moi, ou non, sinon je la passe comme ça.
Mettez-vous là.
Parce
que faire vous-même.
Comme il y a beaucoup de slides, sinon ça va être dérangeant.
Voilà, juste pour ça. Nickel.
Je vais éloigner l'eau avant de créer un problème de... Merci Nathalie, merci Hugo, merci Nathan. Ça fait très bizarre de parler en anglais devant un public français. Moi aussi, je suis française, mais comme ma recherche est en anglais et que les participants, il y en a beaucoup en anglais, je vais le faire en anglais, mais c'est très bizarre tout ça. Ça me perturbe beaucoup. Dans tous les cas, I wanted to thank you for your patience with the talk. I'm going to try to brush through a thematic that I've been working on a lot with colleagues at a lab, which is called BCNUEJ, the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability. We're a group of around 20 people doing urban environmental justice work at the intersection of geography, health, international development, and urban planning. We are part of a broader institute, which is called ICREA, Institute of Environmental Science and Technology, which is located at one of our public universities in Barcelona called the UAB. And these people at the Institute do much more interdisciplinary work than I do. So today is going to be much more of a, let's say, social science driven talk. A lot of what we do tries to work with or co-produce knowledge with civic groups, neighborhood organizations that fight for urban environmental justice. At the end of the talk, I'll show what we call interactive online documentary that we have produced, which is called The Green Divide. But I'll just show a little snapshot of it to try to also see the way in which, as we do research, we can amplify the knowledge and the fights coming from street activists. All right, so the conversation around green gentrification is basically the summary of this following question. To what extent does urban greening, which you can conceive as you want, it's nature en ville, is green roofs, it's also the green transition in relationship to energy retrofits, etc. So to which extent does urban greening contribute to climate and health justice, rather than actually amplify existing urban inequalities? And so all of the work that we do around green gentrification tries to understand the impact that greening has on displacement, on this big phenomenon called gentrification, which I won't go into detail today, but you all know what it is. And also, even if greening does not contribute to gentrification, it's not just that greening is an independent variable to explain gentrification, but even if it doesn't, when you do have gentrification taking place in greening neighborhoods, you have this phenomenon of exclusion, of resegregation, of marginalized groups away from neighborhoods that are becoming more sustainable, green, 15-minute city neighborhoods, etc. So that's a little bit the argument that I'm developing. So are we greening for climate and health justice? What are we looking at here if we bring it back to the climate? In this talk, we're looking at the right part of this little dynamic of urban climate injustices. We're looking at the fact that not only are vulnerable groups the most exposed to climate impacts, they are the ones who will also be displaced by climate resilient infrastructure. And that's the empirical studies that we try to develop in our research. But of course, it's not just about the new greening, and it's not about what we call only greening 1.0. It's also the fact that, let's say at baseline, at 0.0, we have historic inequities in relationship to greening that the new greening actually does not counter, does not address. So greening 1.0 is all of the traditional neighborhoods that you find in your cities that show that by race, class, and ethnicity, there is an unequal access to green space, to nature in the city. So that you can see that a picture of Barcelona, Parc del Turó on the left, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods of Barcelona, and on the right, Parc de la Trinitat. Yes, maybe those neighborhoods had access to some level of greening, but they were surrounded by highway and by freeway corridors. Same for Madrid. Here on the left, the Barrio de Vallecas, the least income or the lowest income per capita of the city, versus the Barrio de Salamanca, the highest income, where the acreage or the area of street trees by inhabitant, the access to street trees by inhabitants is the highest in the city. So that's a little bit the baseline in the 1990s, in the 2000s. Now what we see all around cities, and I look at Paris, and every time I come back, I see the same. It's the introduction of greening that is also branded as part of a new narrative, as part of a new vision of the city. And a lot of it has to do with climate solutions, right? Greening provides cooling, anti-flooding, heat resistant or heat resilient infrastructure. So green is multifunctional, and also it's low cost. So in some ways, it's kind of a win-win solution. And if you think about it, it also has health benefits. So now there's also a whole narrative in cities that is about how greening addresses health impacts and has to do with mental and physical health. So it addresses stress, it addresses poor sleep, etc., etc. And on top of it, and that's in a way what also it can do, it's also a political fix. So if you take the example of Vitoria-Gasteiz, one of the most hit cities by the conflict in Spain that had to do around the nationalist of the ETA. Greening was a way for Vitoria-Gasteiz in the 2000s to really bring residents together around a non-conflictual, a non-partisan agenda that was around bringing nature back into the city. And Vitoria was elected the green capital of 2013 because of this greening work. But then it moved from being a political fix across political factions, if you will, or across different views on the future of the Basque region, to also being an economic fix, a sustainability fix. It actually has become an agenda that is consensual, that is not being contested, and that you actually see expanding along other maybe agendas, but not as much as a priority in cities across the world. That's Boston, one of the cities where I've done a lot of my work. And when you can see is that there is a plan to green 78 square kilometers of the waterfront of Boston, especially more vulnerable neighborhoods. But at the end of the day, it's also part of a new vision. There is branding, there is marketing, there are renderings, there are all types of designs that are associated to the green city. And also what you have, and that's where the economy of it becomes a little bit less, let's say, equity focused than what it's meant to be in a lot of the discourses, is that it's also part of a global competition between cities. So that's a map, for example, of different cities that are competing for being the most green and the most sustainable city in the world. And what you can see by looking at some of them is that they're actually the most expensive cities in the world. Take Vancouver, for example, or take Oslo or Copenhagen. These are not known to be affordable places to live. So that's why we started studying urban greening, because it's not neutral, right? Greening does not just provide a multifunctional universal benefit to everyone. We consider that actually we need to think about for whom is greening in the mid and long term. Is it really for the population that it's meant to support? Because many of these discourses are also equity-driven discourses. And in particular, to what extent are intersectional current and midterm vulnerabilities taken into consideration? Where the argument here that I want to develop now through a lot of empirical studies being that we find the existence of a green paradox. That is that at the end of the day, rather than having a universal benefit to nature, we see that urban greening contributes to being a segregating paradox in large and mid-scale cities with a divided access to nature through different forms of displacement and segregation, which is also what this figure here brings. So, and I developed this little by little, but basically this greening 2.0 has different characteristics of how gentrification is being produced. And at the end of the day, it resegregates residents. It produces these dynamics of social spatial division because of the effect of greening on investment, on speculation, and on property prices in particular. Okay, and so at the end of the day, what does it mean? It means that we really need to reevaluate climate action, and that cities themselves are increasingly, and I will say in the US in particular, where the agenda of climate justice and green justice is particularly developed, where climate planners are also asking themselves the following question. The place to start is to understand where are the people who are desperate and underserved? How are we improving our city? How does this align with where we are putting new sidewalks or improving roads or putting any stormwater infrastructure? It needs to be measured and then managed and reevaluated on a regular basis. Are we benefiting through greening the people that we mean to benefit? Okay, so how do we measure that? We measure this in 5 different forms of displacement. Physical, so traditional measures of gentrification, financial displacement, all the financial dynamics embedded in green gentrification, social, cultural, aesthetics, I won't talk about this as much, and racial dimensions. We really have a strong focus on that in the lab. The studies that we've done for the last 7 years or so have encompassed around 27, 30 cities in Europe and North America, which we chose not because we only wanted to focus on this area, but because we really wanted to compare where do trends of gentrification tend to take place, how intensive are they in one versus the other. And we basically needed to have statistics around green space, around indicators of gentrification, and about certain covariates that could be really comparable. And that's the relationship that we've been measuring. You know, it's essentially identifying everywhere the date of creation of certain green spaces and categorizing them by their types and geolocating them on maps. Then we've also gathered a lot of census tract or block level data on gentrification, trying to build an index of gentrification. So not doing variable by variable, but really bringing together racial, occupational, income, and education variables at the highest spatial resolution. And then we've also looked at covariates, meaning we really know that it wouldn't be enough to only look at green space and gentrification and develop spatial models around them. We also know that we need other covariates that can also explain gentrification. With the overall hypothesis being the creation of new green areas or the inauguration of green projects in a certain time period is relevant or explains gentrification in following time periods, accounting for different covariates. If you want details on the methodological models and data, don't ask me, I'm not the right person. So that's not a question I want. But no, just to simplify, we've done a lot of Bayesian statistics, which is very, very complex spatial models to really try to parse out spatially if one particular intervention can have an impact on an outcome variable. But anyway, I won't present on that today. So physical displacement, what have we found there? If we look at the 27 cities where we have done this analysis of how does greening contribute to green gentrification, we've done a citywide result. Let's say we've parsed out the results in 3 different manners. We've looked at areas where greening plays a subsidiary role in gentrification, that is, it accelerates, it contributes to it, it amplifies gentrification, but it's not the primary factor for gentrification, which are the few cities here on the left. There is something called integrated green gentrification, that is greening together with new real estate, together with new transit, play a role in gentrification. And then we've also have the majority of our cities, which is what is interesting, where greening is a lead factor explaining gentrification. It's not new transit, it's not being a proximity to the city center, it's having new parks, new greenways, clean waterfronts, etc. And here you see a variety of cities, which is also interesting. You have cities that are post-industrial, type Louisville or Milwaukee in the US. You have cities that are at the forefront of this urban green branding, like Nantes in France, for example, or Copenhagen or Vancouver. And you have some which have played an international role in sustainability politics, like Montreal, but are just also accelerating, if you will, in the way in which greening is part of urban redevelopment. So I won't enter as much into detail, but for us, it's also interesting to not just say greening plays a role in gentrification everywhere to the same extent. It's not a homogeneous relationship, but in the majority of places, it does significantly contribute to gentrification. Then financial displacement, what do we find there? What is going on in terms of investment, of the strategies of real estate developers in particular? How do they capture the benefits of greening? In an initial study, we actually took 99 cities, again, North America and Europe, and we gathered a lot of data on affordability indicators. And we looked at a variety of green projects, but the branding also of green projects. And what we found was a high statistically significant association between the cities that brand themselves the most around greening and the most unaffordable places. For example, Vancouver here, again, on the left. So that was kind of these more association type studies where we found a limited elite access to the benefits of greening and the fact that the more you tend to have this agenda, the more unaffordable is the place of living. Then we also interviewed 150 investors in 23 cities, and we tried to understand, what do they do with greening? Are greening contributing to having better financial conditions if they borrow money to build a real estate project? Does greening form part of their branding? Does greening form part of the ways in which they can increase the price of the real estate that they sell? What exactly are they doing with greening? And the response was basically along the lines that what I've just described. Greening facilitates borrowing conditions for investors. If real estate developers build greening themselves or build around greening projects, they can have, again, these lower interest rates. And on top of it, they can have a premium of 10, 15, or 20% of higher sale value when they sell those properties. So in the end, here again, we see that there's a green capture, an urban green grabbing, if you will, to play around this green grabbing theory that Sarah Safransky, for example, has worked on. But there is this sense that it's an elite capture of the benefits of greening that facilitates the fact that only higher income residents and high income developers are able to build or live next in the vicinity of green space. Won't talk as much about that. Then social culturally, what happens? Do people who actually live next to green space and come from more socially vulnerable neighborhoods, do these people benefit? Do they see that it's a value to their lives to live in the proximity of green space? I will give you just an example from Barcelona, just to bring it back a bit to the city. And I'm focusing here on two different neighborhoods, the center of the city in particular. So on the left, you have two green spaces that are in the more recently gentrified part of Barcelona, which is called Poblenou, a post-industrial district. And on the right, you have new green space in the center, historic center of Barcelona and Ciutat Vella. We did interviews and surveys of schools and parents from these schools. And what we found was that in general, in the more advanced gentrification, there is a disconnection from green space. That is that residents do not perceive greening and green areas as places they go to. They socially feel attached to, and there's a sense of community developing there. It's being eroded, it's being erased because of the way in which green spaces is now being used, or plazas or playgrounds are being used by gentrifiers, by tourists. So that also, of course, the characteristics of Barcelona, high tourism, high occupation of public spaces by tourists. So rather than being an asset, it's become what they call a plaza negra, a black space that they don't want to go to. And because also those spaces tend to have higher crimes because of tourism, there's also a sense of lack of safety, lack of comfort that is being lost by more advanced gentrification. On the left, in the more early sense of gentrification, residents report that they see those spaces as assets, that they go to the playgrounds, that they use them, that they meet families, yet they say this is short term. In 5 years, we're out of here because we won't be able to afford it anymore. And they report the presence of hotels, of youth hostels, of high-end student residences that are popping up literally around those green spaces that for them, they see as threats to their ability to stay in the neighborhood. So that's also this form of social cultural displacement. I'm not out of my neighborhood yet. I can resist the increase in real estate prices, but I don't feel comfortable in the space anymore. And here are some quotes that we see from some of the residents we interviewed in different cities. In Montreal, for example, we have a lot more police in the neighborhood that we used to have, and they do patrols of the park. So it's harder to have a healthy mix of people in places. In Dublin, in an area called the Liberties, that's also in the center of the city, that's being heavily greened. We feel so excluded from it that it's a deep anger, it's a big anxiety, and a deep feeling of isolation. And then finally, in Washington, DC, which or where greening is taking place in formerly segregated neighborhoods, residents are reporting about a new park that's being built, the 11th Street Bridge Park. When they are done, most of us probably won't be here to enjoy it. We will be good enough to serve you Slurpees and hot dogs at the River Festival, but not to live here. And then finally, the racial characteristics. How does race also play a role in worsening, in exacerbating inequalities? And we found in an article that we're just about to publish a form of compounded environmental racism, which, if I summarize briefly, means not only are racialized groups feeling that they are not seeing their neighborhood being rid of contamination, toxic, lead pollution, etc. They see that within the same place, there are some kind of glossy green spaces that are bringing up the neighborhood, but at the same time that they are not benefiting from them. So there are these multiple senses of exclusion that I just described very, very briefly. So yes, the sense that within your own neighborhood, you are being displaced because of increasing real estate prices to the worse, even worse housing with lead, with rodents, with everything you can imagine. And that in general, it's in the most air contaminated or water contaminated area of the neighborhood. So it's green and yet it's still polluted at the same time. You also have a form of exclusion from the new development projects that are coming in, your formerly segregated neighborhood. So it's a form of what they call, land theft, or never the ability to possess or to own a space in the neighborhood. So a form of, again, kind of settler colonialism that greening permeates, or that greening embodies. You also have a sense that your voice doesn't matter in environmental policymaking or in local politics, that residents report that at the end of the day, no one asks for their opinion about whether they want a green space. No one comes to ask them to co-design a green space with them, and the environmental groups are not integrating racial groups within their advocacy. So not only is it about, let's say, the outcomes of greening, it's also the procedures of greening that they are critiquing. Then they're also critiquing who is really using those spaces and who is being pushed away. So there's a lot of, for example, parks being used for physical activity, for sports, that are now changing who is in those parks. So rather than, for example, having basketball or having softball, you now have white people walking their dogs, or college students coming in and drinking. And if it's a college student, that doesn't matter. If it's a Black person, the police is being called upon and people are being called a thug. So that's the type of white behavior, white supremacy that residents report on, that's being tolerated in those green spaces, whereas more traditional uses of the space are being literally criminalized. Of course, a big part of being able to stay in a neighborhood is affordable housing. And so rather than seeing a neighborhood that's being green, having more access to affordable housing, residents report that they cannot use their vouchers, that they cannot have access to public housing because either the public housing is being condemned and sold out and privatized, or because landlords don't want to see them in the neighborhood, so they're not able to use their rental vouchers. So this economic housing racism that also becomes juxtaposed to this other form of exclusion that I was talking about. And then finally, a territorial stigmatization, that is that in some ways the neighborhood is being rebranded as livable, as green, as sustainable, and yet in the media, in politics, in discourses, it is being also always pointed at for crime, for drugs, as a no-go zone. So there's always this kind of double discourse, if you will, or territorial stigmatization around greening in racialized neighborhoods. If we bring it back briefly to climate gentrification in particular, which I haven't developed as much, that's also an area that we've been looking at more recently in the lab. That is, if we focus on climate resilient neighborhoods or climate resilient infrastructures, how does green gentrification manifest? What we see here is an intersection of greening with climate insecurity, maladaptation, and exclusive climate protection. Let me give you an example of a slightly different type of study, which was led by my colleague Galia Chokri in the lab, about Philadelphia. So what we did all together in this study was to first identify where is green resilient infrastructure, so stormwater management infrastructure in particular, street trees, heat resilient parks, etc. So where is it going, which are all of the blue dots here on the map. And at the same time, how is social ecological vulnerability being addressed, if you will, by where the location is? What Galia found is that most GRI, most green resilient infrastructure, is concentrated in areas with higher ecological vulnerability, which is great in some ways, but not in areas with high social vulnerability, nor in areas with both social and high ecological vulnerability. So there is a spatial mismatch, if you will, between where does greening go and where are residents both socially and ecologically most vulnerable. What we also saw in the study is that the tracts that have higher gentrification scores, which are the tracts in green, so the polygons in greens here, are those with highest amount of GRI. So the higher the census tract, the higher the GRI. So who attracts greening? And that's also what's interesting. If you look at a period between 2000 and 2016, you have a temporal and spatial juxtaposition between the areas that most gentrify and where these resilient projects go. And so it's not just that greening brings gentrification, it's also that as gentrification progresses, residents of higher income, wider background are able to attract investment in greening, or are able to themselves invest in greening. And then finally, we've also looked at where do residents go? So where are people displaced to, and how does that play out in relationship to greening? So what you can see on the left are the census tracts where Black residents have moved between 2000 and 2016. So the redder the census tracts, the more Black they've become. And on the red and on the right, the most orange or dark orange, the census tracts, the more Hispanic residents have moved to. Now, what do you see? You see that those census tracts are those that have least gained climate resilient infrastructure over the same amount of time, which means that residents are being displaced to areas that are more exposed to heat, that are more exposed to flooding, and that have less investment in the type of projects that can help them address those climate impacts. And now where we are going with the lab is also towards understanding what's coming up in the future. Because what I'm showing you now is, okay, inequality everywhere. It'll be like, Isabelle, 20 different studies. We don't care anymore. You've made your point. But that's the past. The future is trying to understand which are the areas that actually in the future, because of their characteristics, are most exposed to becoming climate gentrified. And so here in the study that we are starting now, we are trying to account for 5 different types of risk that will make an area more climate gentrified. Social risk, that is, okay, an area that has a higher percentage of working class, of non-college educated residents, of lower occupations, etc. An area that also has high climate impacts. And at the same time, when there is resilient investment, where financial costs are rising, and an area that has been earmarked for being a business improvement district or an opportunity zone or for having tax breaks, etc. So if we bring this together in an index that considers exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, we can try to pinpoint which areas, for example, might be hotter, but might have green infrastructure, and at the same time are already starting to gentrify and have higher investment potential because of some tax breaks. So basically, it's an index that will tell you on a city, on a metropolitan scale. We're trying to do that for Barcelona Metro and for Boston Metro, where do investments need to go around housing and around public and affordable housing in particular. Which brings me almost to the end of the presentation, which is, okay, this is all grim, this is looking bad, we're already depressed and it's 10 o'clock. What can we do about it and what are cities doing about it? So that was kind of the last part of this large-scale study we've conducted, which is trying to understand or identify in 50 cities. So we worked with a kind of broader sample than we had. What are the policy and planning tools around or against green gentrification? And what we found is that you need a mix, right? There is no one answer. There is no single bullet magical answer here. What you need is 2 different aspects. You need anti-displacement and you need inclusive greening. Because of what we found, which is that greening is not just gentrifying because of higher housing costs or because investors are coming in and building a luxury tower. I've seen a few on my way here and I was like, interesting what they are doing in the 13e. In Paris, it's also about, not so much. It's really about, okay, what is going to make greening be usable or being resident owned in particular? So we have this report that was a different way in presenting our research called the Policy and Planning Tools for Urban Green Justice report, where we've looked at 50 different tools, some that are anti-displacement and some are, again, more inclusive and more, let's say, open greening. The one on the left, they are targeted at different groups, right? Some are community-wide mechanisms, for example, community land trust. Others are directed at homeowners, lower income homeowners, so tax breaks on income tax breaks or property tax limitations or freezing. Others have to do with density bonuses or inclusionary zoning. For every single unit or group of unit of housing, you need to have a certain percentage that's affordable and public. In Nantes, for example, for every 100 units, 56 of them need to be protected housing. That's huge. That's much more than in Barcelona, I can tell you, where we can't even manage to build anything. Or in the US, where sometimes you're at 15 or 17% affordable housing, and that's not being implemented. Developers go around them. You also have some policies like Portland, Oregon, which has something called the right to return policy, which is for residents that have been segregated away, that have been victims of urban renewal in the 1960s, housing demolished, them segregated into poor quality housing, the right to come back to a neighborhood, and the right to come back especially to greened areas. And then finally, the type of improved and open green amenities. What are we talking about? We are also talking about protecting informal greening. Many of those cities eradicate community gardens, eradicate the more resident-driven greening for more glossy forms of nature in the city. So that's also about what greening is about, protecting the uses, protecting the social natures of residents in their city. You can also use different taxes on developers, on tourists, in particular, to also make sure that a certain percentage of the budget goes towards greening as a more equality-driven plan. You don't need to just think from an equity standpoint, which is what many cities are doing. You can also have a much more broad-based approach to greening, where you ensure that every neighborhood, for example, has access to X amount or X acreage of green space, etc. And then to finish, what a lot of residents are asking for is this question of deep inclusivity and engagement. Greening is being pushed back against because it is perceived as a very top-down process. I can see that in Barcelona. We just lost our really, really progressive mayor in May because she was not able to articulate a communications platform, I would say, and an engagement platform where working class residents were feeling also that greening was for them and by them. So I won't read the quote, but it's basically a shift that you see in planning agency in the US to really go towards the residents and make sure that they are empowered through the process of greening. I want to stop here, and rather than me talking more, I want to show you a few videos that we've had from our documentary, which is called The Green Divide, and that gives you a little bit of testimonies of how people are doing this type of community empowerment work. So what do I do? Parce que là, j'ai pas la même chose.
C'est un petit film.
C'est un petit film, ouais.
C'est un MP4, c'est ça, ou un
non,
bout, ou je
en
sais
fait,
pas
non.
quoi.
J'arrête le partage.
Alors non, on change l'écran du partage.
Du coup, il faut, en fait, je vais loader notre écran. Ici, green divide. Et ensuite, je peux peut-être repartager. Je vais l'écran. C'est celui-là. Voilà. Ah bah non, je peux essayer. Si je le fais pas, non. Ah oui, je peux essayer de le mettre.
Sinon, il y a la souris.
On va voir si ça marche.
C'est bon?
Ouais, on va voir si ça marche.
C'est un peu un jeu de synchronisation.
Okay. All right. So I just want to show you a few testimonies of how people are fighting back against green gentrification. The way that we've worked here was to produce what is called an online interactive web documentary, which is a split version of a feature-length documentary where the reader, the viewer, can interact with the platform and build their own argument, build their own takeaway points about what's happening. So let me, for example, take Portland, Oregon. Okay. Where for each city you have summaries of the type of greening, summaries of the civic mobilization that's taking place, and you have 3 testimonies of civic groups for each of them. So I take Portland. Oh no. Okay.
Le délit universitaire.
C'est la plateforme qui est un peu trop, c'est peut-être de notre faute aussi.
Ça charge, comment tu sais ça? Ah oui,
C'est où? Bon, sinon, on va arrêter, c'est pas grave. Il n'y a pas du tout, je vais le recharger. Sinon, c'est pas grave. Je vais pas le mettre, et puis ça va être tranquille.
Ça charge, mais ça risque d'égayer. Bon, on va voir.
Donc, dans 30 secondes, sinon, c'est pas grave. Sinon, on peut commencer la discussion s'il y a du temps. Et puis sinon, si ça charge, à un moment, ça charge. Sinon, ça charge pas.
Je propose de commencer la discussion à la fois pour les personnes en ligne. Je te propose, Anne-Sophie, de regarder s'il y a des questions en ligne. Et on va faire cette discussion en français, mais ceux qui veulent parler en anglais, qui se sentent à l'aise, on peut passer d'un langage à l'autre. Donc, écoutez, on peut commencer avec est-ce qu'il y a des questions, des commentaires, des interrogations par rapport à cet exposé? Caroline.
Merci beaucoup.
Peut-être que vous vous présentez comme ça.
Oui, alors, je suis Caroline Anguelovski, je suis directrice de recherche à l'université Abonnez-vous et je travaille sur la mobilité. Merci beaucoup pour cette exposé, c'est vraiment passionnant. Et je me demandais si tu avais le sentiment que dans la communauté de recherche déjà, peut-être au-delà, ces questions qui relient les enjeux environnementaux et les enjeux sociaux, est-ce que ça a évolué? Parce que je trouve qu'un exposé comme le tien aurait eu lieu il y a 10 ans, aurait créé des tensions entre les gens qui pourraient taxer de anti-environnementalistes et qui auraient voulu classer des enjeux d'un côté et de l'autre. Est-ce que tu penses, parce que je trouve que c'est un naturel, que les choses sont en train d'évoluer de ce point de vue-là et qu'on prend conscience de la nécessité en fait, d'aborder ensemble ces questions d'injustice et
c'est une question intéressante. Moi, je ne m'étais pas trop posé la question parce que justement, en fait, quand moi je suis revenue des États-Unis en Espagne, il y avait un gros groupe de recherche en Espagne qui travaillait sur l'écologie politique, sur les conflits environnementaux depuis le point de vue de la pauvreté, des inégalités face, par exemple, aux industries extractives en Amérique latine ou en Afrique. Mais il n'y avait jamais de recherche au niveau urbain. Et donc, quand je suis arrivée, c'était une des raisons pour lesquelles il m'avait dit bah, « viens », parce qu'effectivement, ils voulaient aussi un peu avoir plus d'écologie politique urbaine qui regardait les inégalités vertes qui pouvaient se manifester en ville. Et ça, c'était il y a 12-13 ans. Et depuis, c'est vrai qu'il y a une grosse explosion, je pense, partout en Europe sur la question des inégalités vertes, parce que aussi, il y a eu de plus en plus de programmes d'adaptation, de résilience environnementale qui ont mis la nature en ville vraiment au devant, en fait, de l'expérimentation municipale. Et donc, du coup, moi, je vois beaucoup plus d'intérêt maintenant, même au niveau des écologistes, sur cette question-là. Là, par contre, où je vois en Europe qu'il n'y a pas beaucoup encore d'intérêt, très différent des États-Unis, c'est dans le domaine de la santé publique. C'est-à-dire que tous mes collègues qui sont en épidémiologie environnementale, eux, ils sont encore vraiment sur les bénéfices du verre pour la santé mentale et la santé physique. Et plein d'études des études expérimentales ou moins expérimentales qui cherchent un petit peu vraiment à continuer à voir les mécanismes, on va dire, où le verre joue sur la santé. Mais dans des communautés plus critiques d'épidémiologie sociale ou de santé sociale, on va dire que là, il y a un intérêt plus vers le verre aussi, qui fait qu'il y a un peu toutes nos communautés qui viennent ensemble. Là où je vois que c'est encore très limité, c'est dans les domaines de planification urbaine, dans les écoles d'architecture. Mais c'est parce que moi, je ne sais pas trop comment c'est en France, mais en Espagne, c'est très design et très, en fait, pareil.
Pareil. Très, très asocial.
C'est ça, très associal. Donc, du coup, on n'a pas beaucoup de conversations finalement.
Isabelle, pareil, présentez-vous.
Isabelle Anguelovski, je suis économiste, je viens plus de l'écologie politique latino-américaine, qui travaille sur l'extractivisme. Les gens qui étudient une malade explicative. En vous entendant, je comprends parfaitement que l'accent est mis en premier sur les classes, sur c'est vraiment positif. Je pensais vous demander quelle est la place du genre de cette écologie politique. Je pense à la dimension, ça va être situé justement dans cette dimension de la santé environnementale. S'il y a une discussion sur les impacts, je pense aussi à cette dimension de l'espace public. On parlait tout à l'heure des usages de l'espace public, aussi bien sur le genre. Est-ce que ça se mêle aussi à la discussion sur les espaces publics? Je pense aussi à ce qu'on voit partout en écologie féministe, le rôle de genre associé au care pour les femmes, qui souvent dépassent dans les positions de mobilisation pour les inégalités touchent vraiment au quotidien.
Non, c'est aussi pareil, une excellente question. Je n'ai pas présenté vraiment les résultats des études qu'on a pu faire au niveau du genre, parce que c'est vrai que je ne me sens pas autant proche d'elles. C'est plus des collègues que j'ai supervisés dans leur projet de recherche. Et donc, c'est vrai que je les laisse en général plus présenter. C'est vrai que c'est quelque chose, je ne me sens pas confortable d'en parler parce que je sens que vraiment, autant là, c'est quelque chose de vraiment collaboratif, collectif, où on a vraiment tout fait grâce à ce projet de recherche. Il y a eu d'autres recherches qu'on a fait en plus. Amalia Calderon, par exemple, qui est une postdoc dans notre labo, a beaucoup étudié ça. Et ce qui est très intéressant, justement, aussi, c'est que dans la plupart des études qu'on a pu faire sur l'usage des espaces verts, par exemple, celle dont tu parlais là, ou celle à laquelle j'ai fait référence sur Barcelone, c'est en général des mères de famille qui nous répondent sur l'usage des espaces verts, où elles sentent effectivement que c'est plus un bien collectif, ces espaces verts gentrifiés, où elles n'emmènent plus leurs enfants, parce que, justement, il y a un sens de... elles ne se sentent pas bienvenues, elles ne se sentent pas en sécurité. Et en même temps, c'est un espace, beaucoup d'elles sont du Maghreb ou originaires du Maghreb. Et dans leur structure familiale, il y a aussi ce sens de, voilà, c'est ce qu'elle nous expliquait, elles ne sont pas encouragées par leur, on va dire, domaine familial d'aller dans ces espaces verts. Donc, il y a aussi soit une forme de self-exclusion, self-imposed, on va dire, ou imposée par le domaine extérieur de leur famille, qui fait qu'elles soit ne se sentent pas en sécurité, soit les autres leur font ne pas sentir en sécurité. Donc, du coup, elles sont recluses chez elles. Et beaucoup de leurs enfants sont dans des programmes, c'est fou d'ailleurs ce que je vais dire, dans des programmes anti-obésité de la ville de Barcelone, parce que ce sont des enfants qui ne sortent plus, ce sont des enfants qui n'ont plus accès aux espaces de jeu et qui sont identifiés comme population à risque par les centres de santé communautaires qu'on a partout à Barcelone, parce que c'est des enfants qui n'ont plus accès à l'espace public, en fait, et donc qui sont restreints dans des logements pas toujours très salubres, où effectivement, il y a des problèmes qui se développent en plus de santé physique. Donc ça, c'est un aspect. Amalia, ce sur quoi elle a beaucoup travaillé, c'est aussi sur la planification des espaces verts, c'est-à-dire comment la municipalité, par exemple, de Barcelone, planifie le vert avec une perspective de genre. Et là, ce qu'elle voit, c'est qu'il y a une forme de détachement entre la partie institutionnelle, politique, où il y a une grosse... on va dire, il y a un gros discours féministe vers la ville de Barcelone pour les femmes, selon les femmes, d'après les femmes, et les techniciens qui planifient les espaces verts qui ne savent pas le faire, en fait. Donc, ils n'ont pas les outils nécessaires. Donc, par exemple, des espaces verts qui ne sont pas bien éclairés, qui n'ont pas d'infrastructure, qui n'ont pas de mobilier, qui n'ont pas toujours d'activité, par exemple, sociale, que les femmes demandent, et du coup, qui font que ce sont des espaces plus masculinisés, on va dire. Et donc, il y a un peu ce disconnect. Mais c'est vrai que la ville de Barcelone est hyper mobilisée pour cette ville verte féministe. Sauf que comme on vient changer de maire maintenant, c'est un peu en déclin. Mais voilà. Mais c'est vraiment quelque chose sur lequel des collègues à moi ont beaucoup travaillé. C'est très intéressant parce qu'effectivement, il y a aussi cette ville, cet aspect de comment changer la ville productive à une ville plus care-driven et comment les espaces publics peuvent être des espaces pour cela. Je n'ai pas présenté un projet qui est très intéressant à Barcelone, par exemple, qui s'appelle les superblocks, c'est-à-dire que ce sont des espaces des pâtés de maison de 3 par 3 qui sont complètement péatonalisés et où il y a des nouveaux petits espaces verts de proximité créés. Donc, on imagine des blocs de 3 par 3. Et là, il y a ce qu'ils appellent les super blocks of care, c'est-à-dire comment est-ce que ces espaces peuvent être dynamisés, peuvent être accompagnés pour que les écoles y viennent, pour que les centres pour les personnes âgées aussi occupent ces espaces ou pour que les personnes âgées qui vivent seules à la maison puissent aussi se sentir en sécurité et également sentent que ce sont des espaces où elles sont bienvenues parce qu'il y a des activités sociales et physiques qui se font dans ces super blocks. Ça, c'est assez intéressant.
Je vais peut-être prendre quelques questions en ligne. Il y en a déjà quelques-unes, enfin, il y en a pas mal déjà. Thank you for your highly interesting presentation today. Small towns and medium-sized cities also implement winning policies, and we can legitimately think that they may lead to the same consequences of gentrification as they are now reconsidered by public authorities. But for now, it is an hypothesis. What is your opinion about it? Do these cities anticipate enough collateral effects? And have you heard about similar studies as yours in small and mid-sized cities from your team of others? Ça vient de Fabien L. Et vous pouvez répondre en français.
Merci. Non, c'est vrai que c'est intéressant la question de dans quel type de ville, dans quelle taille de ville on voit ces processus de gentrification vers. On a des villes de taille moyenne, on pourrait dire, certaines villes de taille moyenne comme Valence, comme Milwaukee, comme Louisville, comme Bristol en Angleterre. Donc, on n'a pas que des grandes villes, mais c'est vrai qu'on tend à avoir des villes qui sont exposées internationalement aux investissements, aux flux de personnes, d'informations, etc. Donc, on ne parle pas des petites villes. Dans les petites villes, est-ce qu'on anticipe ces effets? Dans la mesure où on voit que beaucoup des effets sont liés à la spéculation immobilière, aux intérêts internationaux, à la manière dans laquelle les villes sont des terrains d'investissement immobilier et mobilier. C'est vrai qu'on ne s'attend peut-être pas à avoir autant de problèmes, entre guillemets, dans les petites villes que dans les grandes villes. Mais bon, je ne peux pas spéculer sur quelque chose que je n'ai pas étudié. Mais, disons que sûrement l'impact est moins grand et moins rapide.
Il y avait Madame.
Alors, I'm going to speak in English. My name is Francesca, and I am a postdoc at the Urban School, Sciences Po Urban School. And I've started in January project on major diversity with a 4-year project. I've been, I'm Italian, but I've been working in Argentina for almost 10 years. And I've been working on informality, settlements, policy approaches for informal settlements, and I really enjoyed the presentation and my work. And I have a question regarding the scarcity of literature that compares and fosters dialogue between Global South and North cities. And I wanted to ask you, I know I'm familiar with the work you did in Latin America around gentrification, and I wanted to ask if you think it might be useful to build a directive framework that can help us understanding the differences of approaches in terms of urban greening between the North and the South, considering also that in the Global South we have a lack of public investments in terms of urban greening, incremental and bottom-up planning, and also an important role of multilateral banks and international organizations shaping for policy framework, policy making, at least in the case I know in Argentina and in Latin America as well. So I wanted to ask you if you worked a bit on this kind of directive strategy, building a framework that can help us understand the differences and yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's also an important point because this green orthodoxy is not just in global north cities. You can see that it expanded. Places like Medellin or Rosario in Argentina are just also points now of investment due to the livability, the sustainability politics, etc., that they are putting forth. What we find in Latin America when we've done other research was that there's a direct form of displacement of informal housing when greening takes place. So you don't just have these kind of slower dynamics of speculation and new projects that little by little push people away. You can really see that new glossy park is going to remove real estate, or let's say informal housing, while actually privileging high-end investment. And some of this, it's also about unequal enforcement of land use regulations, because you also see, let's say, anti-erosion green projects in particular being favored in the hillsides of a lot of these Andean cities, and informal settlements are demolished along the way, but then high-end housing, even though they are within protected areas of greening, they get to stay. So the unequal enforcement is really something that also we've seen is part of gentrification in those places. I don't know whether the word gentrification is always the best one to use, but green inequalities maybe is a way to also see that. So that's what Rio, for example, during the Olympics, a lot of the parks, the new parks that were built in Rio directly displaced favelas. That was completely clear. So, do you want me to show the video and then I can disappear? I feel bad, I'm talking too much space.
There are two more questions that we're going to take, then we shoot the videos. And
Okay.
the next question is from Will Ward online. As poverty, democracy, and literacy are improving, stakeholders are using this metric to justify that welfare is globally improving. How do we find other metrics to counterbalance this narrative, give visibility to socio-ecological justice?
C'est une question qui va t'aider à répondre en français.
N'importe quelle réponse aussi peut aider.
Est-ce que tu peux nous expliquer pourquoi c'est important dans cette recherche de garder à la fois des preuves empiriques de la green gentrification et des drivers, et pourquoi c'est de garder aussi le pendant sur les mobilisations? Pourquoi c'est important de garder les deux dans ta recherche? Et peut-être que c'est difficile de trouver des métriques communes, mais
Ok. C'était aussi une question. Ok. Non, je pense qu'en général, ce qui est intéressant dans aussi une approche qui zoome sur les résistances sociales, les résistances environnementales, c'est qu'en fait, on se rend compte qu'il y a aussi une évolution dans la justice environnementale, dans le mouvement de justice environnementale. Et c'est pour ça, moi, que je me suis intéressée à ce thème en particulier. C'est que dans les années 2000, il y avait vraiment, il y a peut-être une quinzaine d'années, et même encore maintenant, une demande de plus de verre, plus de qualité environnementale, d'éradication de différentes formes de pollution dans les quartiers plus défavorisés, dans les quartiers noirs et latinos en particulier aux États-Unis. C'est là où le mouvement de justice environnementale est né, on va dire, dans le nord global. Et du coup, ça s'est passé à « Ah, mais attention, tous ces projets-là, en fait, ils sont en train de nous foutre dehors ». Et donc, par exemple, il y avait beaucoup de discours autour des community gardens, des jardins communautaires, qui sont des petits projets qui, à la base, sont très informels, mais en fait, qui, juxtaposés les uns par rapport aux autres, ont aussi été pris dans des engrenages de gentrification dans beaucoup de villes aux États-Unis, Boston, Philadelphie, San Francisco, etc., parce qu'il y avait tout cet aspect de beautification, d'amélioration de la qualité esthétique des quartiers qui ont été appropriés par les promoteurs immobiliers. Ce qui fait qu'environ, il y a une dizaine d'années, on a commencé à voir une évolution dans le mouvement environnemental, de justice environnementale aux États-Unis, qui était « Ah, mais attention, tout vert n'est pas bénéfique et on peut en fait se voir évicté, on peut se voir mis dehors par ces projets-là. D'où en fait beaucoup plus de mobilisation maintenant qui sont autour de green equity ou equitable green development, où le lobbying ou l'advocacy ou la montée de fonds que beaucoup d'ONG locales, beaucoup de groupes locaux font aux États-Unis autour en fait d'un vert qui est basé sur la transition juste, sur la justice raciale, sur des domaines, on va dire, qui peuvent vraiment mettre ensemble le droit au logement et le droit à la nature et le droit à la protection climatique. Ça, je ne sais pas trop dans quel domaine on le voit ici en France, mais je sais qu'en Espagne, nous, c'est quelque chose qui n'est pas encore trop articulé, par exemple.
On va prendre une dernière question de ma collègue Isabelle Anguelovski et puis après, on va passer à la vidéo et après, de toute façon, on va avoir 5 minutes de pause avant d'entamer la prochaine session. J'ai beaucoup réduit la pause, mais on a plus de retard. Vous comprendrez, mais rien ne vous empêche d'aller chercher des croissants Donc voilà, Syria,
Je voulais savoir.
peut-être qu'elle est présente.
Ah oui, Myriam Milena, je suis professeure d'aménagement et urbanisme à Rennes. Et je voulais savoir si l'éviction dont vous parliez concernait aussi les homeless, les sans-abri, parce que souvent les espaces verts, y compris très centraux, sont des lieux de refuge dans des places très centrales. Par exemple, à Poblenou, on voit énormément de migrants dans la rue. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a aussi un autre monde informel qui coexiste. Et voilà, est-ce que dans ces espaces-là, ils y sont, ou est-ce que les whites, la suprématie blanche de ces parcs a des systèmes de vigilance pour les vider lorsqu'ils sont là? Vous avez parlé de ça pour les blacks, mais pour les migrants et les homeless, qu'est-ce qui se passe?
Il se passe la même chose. Je pense que tu l'as très bien décrit. En fait, ce n'est pas seulement une question raciale, c'est aussi la question sur les plus vulnérables des populations, des résidents, en fait, finalement. Qui a le droit de résider en ville et qui a le droit d'occuper ces espaces verts? C'est intéressant parce qu'une des premières études sur la gentrification verte par Sarah Dooling, c'était sur comment le rebranding de certains espaces verts crée des nouveaux processus de homelessness sur la côte ouest des États-Unis. Et Sarah, donc, elle a vraiment travaillé sur la question de quel est le droit à la maison. She was like, what's the right to home, en fait? Which home? And when a green space is a home and becomes gentrified, then invisible residence. Que là, en fait, ça devient en fait la question de qui est visible ou pas dans l'espace vert. Et là, c'est exactement ça aussi. C'est qu'en fait, du coup, les plus vulnérables, qui en fait, dans les études qu'on a faites aussi aux États-Unis, malheureusement, il y a un gros problème d'addiction à différentes substances, notamment le fentanyl dans ces espaces verts, font que ce sont des personnes encore plus vulnérabilisées et encore plus… Enfin là, c'est le droit à la vie qui est littéralement questionné dans ces espaces-là, parce que du coup, ils finissent dans des conditions éparpillées, on va dire, et plus du tout avec un système indirect, en fait, de protection qui pouvait exister dans ces parcs entre eux, en fait. On voit aussi que leur réseau d'entraide, quand les parcs deviennent fermés ou contrôlés ou policés, les personnes sans logement se voient aussi encore plus vulnérabilisées, en fait, dans leur droit à la vie, même plus qu'autre chose. Ici, c'est pareil, j'imagine. Hein.
Oui, c'est compliqué. Parce qu'en fait, il y a je me permets juste
Non,
de
non,
dire
please.
que sur nos études, y compris sur Paris d'ailleurs, il y a la question de la gestion des espaces qui entre en ligne de compte, et notamment les espaces moins gérés qui sont plutôt dans les quartiers pauvres, abritent plutôt Après, c'est une question de lien entre la gestion de l'espace vert et la richesse environnante. Et pour le coup, d'un point de vue de la biodiversité, les espaces les plus riches sont dans les quartiers les plus pauvres. À Paris. Ouais, c'est quand même des drôles de renversement parce qu'ils sont moins gérés.
Ils ont moins géré, c'est ça, ils ont moins géré.
Donc, on a des espèces de renversements écologiques qui sont assez étonnants, où le green space, c'est pas juste une pelouse verte.
C'est ça.
Peut-être on va regarder ton film.
Yeah. Verde, en fait, c'est une coopérative verte qui se trouve dans un quartier noir de Portland qui s'appelle Cully, enfin noir et latino à Cully, qui est en train de mettre en place différents projets de résilience climatique lidérés par les populations noires et latino de ce quartier. C'est mieux que ce soit elle qui parle que moi.
Right now, we're in the heart of the Cully neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, and that's where Verde is located. And we've been doing our work for the past decade and a half. We work at the intersection of environmental justice, economic justice, and racial justice. And the reason why we do that is because neighborhoods like Cully are environmental justice neighborhoods, which is disproportionately dotted with trash heaps and car scrap yards and other sort of industrial uses. There's also a serious lack of green space and parks. Building environmental wealth, we're not just talking about the green assets themselves, such as parks, paved streets, tree plantings, bioswales. We're also talking about building the political power of community members to develop the political analysis and the tools to be able to advocate for long-standing policy changes that really impact the way that they live their lives. There is a pervasive narrative of Portland being a green and sustainable city where everyone rides bikes and goes to the farmer's market and composts, and there's this idea of this green utopia, but that is contradictory to the realities of the lived experiences of so many Portlanders. We've always been an extremely divided city. We have a lot of racial disparities here. You know, rapid gentrification and displacement has disproportionately impacted the Black community members here and all other communities of color. You know, that's the work that we've tasked ourselves with doing, is saying, no, all these sort of green investments that are happening are making other people wealthy, wider, wealthier communities is where we're seeing those investments. You know, we can do that ourselves in a different way, like Cully Park, for example, which we turned a 25-acre former quarry and then turned into a landfill. We did the advocacy, we did the work of fundraising, and then we actually built the park itself, creating jobs. I mean, that longevity of that vision of creating environmental wealth, a park, took so many years and so many hands, but the vision came from within our communities, and we acted upon that. Our approach has continued to be that we want to build these environmental assets, not for future residents, but we want to build it with current residents who are Cully community members for the benefit of Cully community members, as to not perpetuate this green divide that we see, which is wealthier, wider communities being able to essentially have these green enclaves in which they will be protected from the devastating impacts of a very uncertain future. You know, we do not want that. We want to be in control and understand how to harness these resources and to ensure that this can be a driver for sustainability and for environmental wealth, and not just for gentrification, displacement, and the perpetuation of a green gap, or as we can say, a green divide.
Il y a 17 autres vidéos de ce genre, si
Il y en a regardé en ligne.
déjà, voilà. Merci beaucoup. Attention.
D'accord, merci beaucoup pour cet impressionnant travail et cette très